Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for coming. We are nothing if not punctual around here. So the countdown hit 0. We're going to go ahead and get started. Thank you all very much for joining us. If we haven't met before, my name is Tony Mullenkamp, and I want to thank you again. We have people I know that have not been to one of these sessions before or have not heard an introduction, so I'm just going to take a couple minutes, introduce my firm and our people, and tell you a little bit about what we're hoping to accomplish today. As I said, my name's Tony Mullenkamp. The company's name is Mullenkamp & Company. It was founded by my father, Ron, in 1977, and we are located just south of here on Route 19 in Wexford. You will hear me refer to him as Ron, Dad, or the boss. Kind of depends on what I have to say about him at the time. It's all the same guy. You'll get a chance to see him here in just a moment. He'll be making some introductory remarks. Dad started in this profession in 1968 after getting a Bachelor's of Science as a mechanical engineer from MIT and his MBA from Harvard Business School. He worked for a few other people for 10 years before founding our firm in 1977. 78, I guess it was. No, 77. But his entire career has been devoted to investing money for people, and he continues to do that full-time today. Today we have 16 people in our company, 5 of whom are analysts that work with Ron on the research, the analysis, and helping with the stock picking. The rest of us are here in marketing and client service, administrative, and operations roles. They are all here today. They should all have a name tag. If you haven't had a chance to meet them, please take a chance to do so. Very interesting group, a lot of backgrounds, a lot of experience. I'm really proud of the people that we have in the firm and how we take care of our clients and what we do, which simply put is we put money to work. Primarily for people that want their money to work as hard for them as they had to work for it. Our clients are looking to grow their assets over periods of time, best measured in years, if not decades, and they generally have 3 objectives in hiring us. They ask us to please don't lose my money. I worked very hard. I want to make sure it's safe. Make it grow so I can have a decent return and do it in ways that allow me to sleep at night in the process. And it's that allow you to sleep at night in the process that brings us here today. We like to communicate what we're seeing and doing. We publish a lot of articles and newsletters. They're on our website. You get them electronically. You'll get them physically. I think out front you have copies of our newsletters, our books, all designed to try and build that comfort, help you understand what we're doing and why we're doing it. These seminars are a part of that. We hope that you'll walk out of here either glad that you're working with us, or you're thinking seriously about getting our help, or thinking of someone that could use a conversation, would benefit from an introduction, that we might be able to help them. So that's who we are, that's what we do. Let's take a look at what we're hoping to accomplish today. We're going to try and do 3 things primarily. Ron's going to spend a few minutes updating us on what's been going on in the last couple of weeks. Then Tammy Neff is going to be talking to us about game changers in biotechnology. She has promised that she can tell us everything there is to know about biotech and healthcare all in 30 minutes. So I think that's going to be a whirlwind. Very interesting things. Tammy has a lot of experience in this arena, and what she has to share is just cool, frankly. It's a huge and complicated topic, and Tammy has taken the lead on this, so I'm looking forward to what she has to share. And then finally, my brother, our analyst, Jeff Mullenkamp, is going to talk to us a little bit about Europe and Japan, largely because those countries have not been in the news lately. They've been largely ignored. There was a lot of concern, if you remember, Portugal, Ireland, Greece, Spain. Remember when Greece was going to drag the whole world down into this never-ending pool of fail, and yet we haven't heard much about it in the last couple years. We think it's important to continue to pay attention to it, and Jeff's going to be doing that for a couple of minutes. Now, we will take questions, as always. There's note cards on your packet. Jot your question down, we'll take it. And before we start, I was asked to talk a little bit about the proxy process we just went through on behalf of the Mullenkamp Fund. People have said, well, what has changed? The answer is absolutely nothing. We're still running the money. Mullenkamp & Company is running the money. It's a different set of trustees that are now keeping an eye on us. The design was frankly to save us money in legal, compliance, and trustees' fees and save us time. So we essentially replaced one board of trustees with another. They oversee a dozen funds, so we're enjoying economies and efficiencies of scale. Hopefully, it all ended in early September. I suspect nobody's known the difference since. I certainly haven't. That should remain true. If you have questions about that, want to talk about that in more detail, happy to do so. Grab me out here, buy me a cup of coffee, and we'll go through it in as much agonizing detail as you like. It was mind-numbing for me. But that's the upshot of it, okay? So, with that being said, on behalf of the entire firm, thank you for joining us. And Ron, let's get started.
Thank you, Tony. There it is.
Yeah, there's your remote.
I was just going to catch up on a little bit on what's happened in the last 6 months or so since we had one of these seminars. We said back in April that there was all kinds of things going on in Japan and Europe and China. Ukraine was big at the time. Jeff will catch you up on some of that in a little bit. In July, in our newsletter, we said that both the world GNP growth had been downgraded and the U.S. GNP growth had been downgraded. Each of the last 4 years coming into the new year, the estimates were that the GDP in the U.S. would grow by over 3%. In each of those last 4 years, that got whittled down to 2% over the period of time. And in July, the economists that follow the world economy downgraded that as well. We also said in July that stocks had reached something like full value. What you see on the screen is simply a plot of the S&P the last 6 months. So the first hump up there, in July we said that most stocks had reached fair value, and we were going to become a little bit quicker to lighten up when things did so. One of the things that we added to our checklist after 2008 was the question, who might have to sell and how much? You probably know that some people buy stocks on margin. Hedge funds in particular buy stocks on margin, so if stocks start going down, they end up having to sell simply to meet your margin requirements. Some people psychologically, when prices go down, for psychological reasons, have to sell. And we had a bit of a correction in late July, August. You see a dip there. And then along came September, October, and it started going again. And you'll see that for a couple of days, it looked like things were starting to cascade. Now, this was also about the time that we were hearing about ISIS. We were hearing about Ebola. Anybody heard about Ebola the last 2 weeks? That was all the front page news just 1 month ago. So, these things, but these things come along, and typically what happens is you get the kind of drops we had in October when several of them hit at the same time. And since then, it started to cascade in late September, early October, reversed itself, and things have kind of hit new highs. If you page through a chart book, there's a whole lot of stocks that have jumped in the last 2 weeks without really a common theme that I can find. We talk about hedge funds having to sell, but there's also a lot of people who use various kinds of computer-generated signals. And when the computer says sell, they sell things. When the computer says buy, they buy things. And so you're getting jumps that look different than they did 30, 40 years ago when people were making the decisions. So you get this kind of stuff going on, and frankly, it's making us a little bit nervous. So we've generated some cash since July. Which means that this year we'll pay long-term capital gains taxes. We've done a pretty good job the last 5 years of deferring that. I will say the taxes we'll pay will all be long-term capital gains. There's no income tax or short-term capital gains tax. So as I say, some stocks spiked down, including energy stocks. We'll say a little bit more about energy in just a moment. And some have since ticked up. Many of you have seen this chart. This is simply a plot of crude oil and natural gas. Crude oil being in the red on the top, natural gas being the black on the bottom. And we've been saying for several years that this is a major driver in energy. You'll notice at the right-hand side in red, in the last month, crude oil, 2 months maybe, crude oil has gone from $110 a barrel to $80 a barrel. And the surprise in the middle of that was when the Saudis said, we can live with prices of crude below $100. Pretty much for the last several years, they've tried to maintain the price at 100 or better. They've said we can live below that, and that just changed all the metrics. So now they're looking at it's currently just over 80 on a world basis. You've probably noticed that price of gas at the pump, which last winter was running close to $4, is now bumping close to $3. In the middle, right now, because of all the oil they're getting out of North Dakota, gasoline is actually cheaper in the middle part of the United States than on the coast. Historically, the cheapest gasoline was on the coast because it would come in by tanker, that's where the refineries are, and there would be the transportation cost by the time they got to the Midwest. Well, there are a few refineries in the Midwest. It's now cheaper. Gasoline is cheaper. In Western Ohio, it's 20 or 30 cents a gallon cheaper than it is here. So it's simply transportation costs coming back and forth. But when the Saudis said they could live below 100, now the question is it going to be 80 or is it going to be 70? Folks, there's 42 gallons to a barrel. So when crude oil is at $84 a barrel, that's $2 per gallon of gasoline in just the crude. And the other dollar comes in, it takes about 50 or 60 cents to do all the refining. There's about 20 cents worth of taxes in there, but it literally, the price of gasoline tends to run with the price of crude, and that's the ratio. When we look at natural gas, now the red line on the top here is crude oil, and as you can see from I believe the right-hand side, it's gone from 110 to 80. The blue line is what we call Henry Hub price of natural gas. Henry Hub is located in Louisiana. There's an intersection of a lot of natural gas pipelines, hence Hub. And the natural place to have an auction is where the pipelines come together. And you'll notice the blue line has been running about $4 an MCF for natural gas at the Henry Hub pricing. And we've been saying for several years we thought that natural gas would gravitate around $4. In southwest Pennsylvania, there's another hub called Dominion South Point. Dominion is the major pipeline there. That is the black line. There is a glut of natural gas in Pennsylvania. Hence, for most of the last, we're running, well, this is year to date. So since about February or March, price of gas in Pennsylvania has been cheaper than it has been in Louisiana. Today, the Henry Hub's about $4. Oh, incidentally, the uptick you see on the right-hand side of this is because they're expecting cold weather. Everybody knows the Arctic blast is coming in, and that's the uptick at the right-hand side of this. But today, at Henry Hub, it's about $4 an MCF. In Pennsylvania, it's about $2.50. In Boston, it's $8 because there isn't enough pipeline to go from Pennsylvania to Boston. And we'll refine this just a little bit. This is a plot that's in our, if you haven't gotten it, there's a booklet outside of what we did on natural gas. We did a whole seminar on it 2 years ago. Because natural gas, historically about half of it is used for home heating, which of course is very seasonal, this is a plot of the amount of gas in storage. We put gas into storage all through the summer. Along about November, we start taking it out. Last year was a cold winter, so the gas in storage got below normal. You see the blue line, which is the current line, got well below normal. There were some fears that we wouldn't be able to build back up. We're pretty close back up to normal. 2 years earlier, in the winter of 11-12, we had a warm winter, and the price of gas got cheap. But anyway, because of this fluctuation, the spot price of gas looks like this. And this is going from 2010. You'll see the blue line is Marcellus gas. The yellow is New England. The orange is Chicago. And you'll notice the spikes going up tend to occur in January, February, particularly if you have a cold winter. As the gas in storage starts to run down, the spot price runs up. Last year was a particularly cold winter, so we had this huge spike in Chicago and in New York. You'll notice that in the Marcellus, it never really quite got there because there's a glut of gas in Pennsylvania. Prices tend to be the lowest late in the summer when it looks like we're filling up the natural gas holdings. Well, last year, Chicago had this big spike. Folks, they're giving they're flaring gas in North Dakota, but there isn't enough pipeline coming from North Dakota to Chicago, so Chicago had this huge spike. New York had the huge spike. Boston looks a whole lot like New York. But this is what's happening with natural gas. Meantime, Marcellus tends to be cheap. I would encourage each of you as you get how many of you heat with natural gas? When you get your bills this winter, check it. My guess is you'll find prices all winter below $4 an MCF, probably closer to $3. And as you saw from the earlier, you're paying about half for gas what you would pay if we weren't drilling and fracking. But right now, There's a glut, and there's likely to continue to be a glut in Pennsylvania because the crunch is on pipelines. So what we've seen happen in the last 6 months is the world economy estimates have come down, prices of stocks have gone up, a whole lot of things have been hitting the fan. The things we've been talking about for 3 or 4 years are all there. Jeff will cover a little bit of that sometime later. And it's become much more pick and choose. We've raised some cash. We're finding some things we like, many of which are in the biotech area that Tammy will talk about. And it's going to be interesting to see what happens with energy through this winter. What happened as the price of oil came down, price of oil stocks came down, also the price of natural gas stocks came down, even though the price of gas didn't. So frankly, we're buying more of these things. They hurt us in the last 3 months, but we think the long-term stuff is still there. That's the quick and dirty bringing you up to date. We'll let Tammy bring you up to date on what's happening in biotech.
Thanks, Ron. I've worked in the healthcare industry for the past 25 years in a variety of roles, and each one has provided a unique perspective. I started out providing clinical care as a nurse, served as the director of operations for a physician practice group, managing the business aspects related to healthcare. And for the past 11 years, I've been an investment analyst here at Mullenkamp & Company, researching the healthcare industry, looking for investment opportunities. And when I take a step back and think about healthcare, I'm reminded of Charles Dickens. These are the best of times, these are the worst of times. These are the best of times because what's happening now at the intersection of science, technology, and engineering is a game changer. It's transforming the face of medicine and how care is being delivered. As a consumer, we benefit from these new innovations. As an investor, there are a lot of opportunities to look, to participate. These are the worst of times because for some, the innovations and new treatments won't come soon enough. It takes time for discoveries made in the lab to make their way through all the channels into routine medical practice to improve the human condition. Some of the exciting things I'm going to talk about today fall into that category, but we're moving in the right direction. Also, the healthcare industry and the system of care delivery is complicated, faces challenges related to the financing of healthcare, the supply and demand of providers, and navigating the system, quite honestly, can be somewhat challenging. So we could probably spend a couple of days talking about the healthcare industry, but today I'm going to spend about 30 to 40 minutes covering just 3 areas, focusing. And at the end of this presentation, I'd like you to walk away with a better understanding of these 3 areas. First, the healthcare industry as it relates to you and me, the consumer. Second, discuss some of the game-changing innovations and advances that are taking place in the field of biomedical science. And finally, talk about the related investment opportunities. And if you're one of our clients, how you've been participating in some of the stuff that I'm going to talk about today. So let's get started with the healthcare industry and the consumer. Today, on average, on a per-person basis, 22 cents of every dollar spent in this country goes to healthcare. This chart shows real U.S. personal consumption expenditures in the United States. And it's tracked by the U.S. government, the Bureau of Economic Analysis to be precise. It shows inflation adjusted, that's what the term real means, for the year 2013, because that's the most complete data set that we have. And what they've done is they've taken all spending in this country, added it up, divided it by the US population to get a per person basis, or what's known as per capita, and they've categorized it. And what you see here is the biggest piece of the pie goes to healthcare. 22% of all spending in this country goes to healthcare. It's a pretty big number, it's the biggest piece. So what goes into this number? Well, you have things like medical services, so your doctor's visits, your hospital stays, your surgeries. You have your lab testing, your medications, your outpatient physical therapy, ambulatory therapy, hip and knee replacements, that sort of thing. And it includes not just the money that you pay out of pocket, but benefits paid on your behalf by your health insurer. You'll note the second biggest category is housing. 19% goes to housing and utilities, and 14% goes to food. So these three categories make up over just half of all consumer spending. But again, the biggest piece of the pie is healthcare. It's interesting, especially as a healthcare analyst. A lot of places to find opportunity. One of the ways we at Moellenkamp and Company attempt to identify investment opportunities is to look for long-term trends that benefit the consumer. This tends to show up in consumer spending over time. So let's take a look at consumer spending patterns over time and see what it shows us. We've just said that in 2013 dollars, 22% of all spending goes to healthcare. Taking a step back to 1980, it's a little bit hard to see, but the number says 11% of all spending went to healthcare. This has been adjusted for inflation, so it's real, and it means we're comparing apples and apples. What's interesting is housing remained constant at about 19%, and food was about 22% in 1980. Taking a step back even further in 1960, also adjusted for inflation, so that we're comparing apples and apples, we see that 6% of all spending went to healthcare, where housing remained constant at 19, and food was about 25. So you can see, starting in 1960, we nearly doubled what we spent on healthcare to 1980, and we've doubled again from 1980 to 2013. So the trend is we're spending a lot more on healthcare. So how do you explain this pretty significant increase in consumer spending on healthcare over the last 54 years? Well, first, we're about 3 times more prosperous than we were in 1960. So we have more money to spend, which means some of it could go to healthcare. But the healthcare industry has had and continues to have some pretty attractive growth drivers. We have continuous innovation that brings new products to market. We have things like 1960s perfecting open heart surgery. 1970s brought us MRI technology that allowed us to more precisely diagnose less invasively. Today, we have precision medications that seek out cancerous and other cells, which target them while preserving the healthy ones. This is just an example of some of the continuous innovation that has occurred, and the same type of innovation is continuing to occur. We'll talk about that more in a few minutes. We have the aging baby boomers. The demographic trends here are in the early innings. The aging baby boomers consume and demand more services on things like hip and knee replacements, dentures, medications. There's globalization that drives the growth in healthcare. As other countries become more prosperous, they consume and demand more services, which means our companies can export overseas. And we have expanded insurance coverage. 1966 brought us Medicare. You'll note the big jump between 1960 and 1980. Part of it was related to this. Medicare provides coverage for healthcare benefits to anyone age 65 and older. In 2010, we had the Patient and Protection and Affordable Care Act, and we're in the early innings of seeing how rolling out this new insurance program will provide health insurance coverage and benefits to millions of Americans. And over time, the types of services that were covered have changed as well. In the 60s, it predominantly covered things like hospital stays and surgeries. Well, today, this has expanded to include outpatient care, physical therapy, chiropractic care, medications, artificial limbs, etc. We have robotic surgery, we have pacemakers. So we have more money to spend. There's some growth drivers going on in the healthcare industry, and we're benefiting as consumers. with more products that improve our quality of life, and as we see here, increase our lifespan. This chart shows life expectancy in this country at birth from 1900 to 2012. And what it shows is, in 1900, if you were born in 1900, the average life expectancy was about 47 years. If you're born in 2012, the average life expectancy is 78 years old. A couple points here. You'll note that the drop in 1918 was related to a virus, flu pandemic, that wiped out a big chunk of the population, so that affected the chart. But a lot of the increase in life expectancy is related to the biomedical innovations that I'm talking about today, as well as some other industrial and technological advances. This picture of the doctor shows what healthcare used to be like. In the late 1800s, equipped with the tools of their time, doctors would provide comfort in the care of one's home. Since then, we've come a long way in full circle. We have sophisticated, state-of-the-art inpatient treatment facilities. We have robotic surgery, artificial hip and knee replacements, and we have smart technology that's allowing care to be provided in the comfort of your home. Again, you can interact with your healthcare provider through your smartphone or your computer. So when you think about these innovations and all the progress that's been made over the last couple of decades, you can begin to imagine how healthcare is over $130 billion a year in research for medical improvement. And this leads to the second topic I'm going to cover today, the game-changing advances that are taking place in the field of biomedical science. The game changers I'm going to talk about include personalized medicine, rethinking the war on cancer, and curing chronic conditions. What is personalized medicine? Personalized medicine is the customization of healthcare based on your unique genetic makeup. I like to think of it as an owner's operations manual that you and your doctor can use to refer to look at your health, risk for disease, and if you do get sick, how to approach treating or managing your disease. The advances that are taking place in the field of biomedical science using your genetic material are allowing this kind of treatment shift. And we're shifting the model of care from treating disease to preventing disease. It takes some time, but that's the direction we're moving in through these innovations. There's a saying in medicine, prevention is the best medicine. Some of us never go to the doctor unless we have to. Some go only when we're sick or forced to. Others go because you know that routine screening and prevention is the best medicine. There are some simple behavioral things that you can do to improve your health regardless. Most of us know that eating healthy, drinking water, adequate exercise and sleep go a long way toward improving our health. Disease prevention has been around for decades. Most of us are familiar with the notion that you can lower your risk for cancer by not smoking. You can lower your risk for diabetes and heart disease by managing your weight. The disease prevention I'm talking about runs a little bit deeper, and it's anchored in your DNA. Think of DNA, your genetic makeup, as the code of life. Most of us are familiar with the notion that we get some of our physical traits, things you can see, passed on by our parents through the genetic material. We get our things like eye color, hair color, and physical build from our genes. There are also unseen pieces of information contained in your genetic material. Our health and risk for disease and information about our potential for getting sick in the future exists in our DNA and our genes. And it's important to note that it exists whether or not we feel sick. So having the tools of technology and the science and the capacity to tap into that and use that information becomes important as we think about personalizing medicine. We've come a long way in a relatively short period of time as it relates to DNA. It was 1953 when James Watson and Francis Crick first described the double helix structure of DNA. In 2003, scientists completed a map of the entire human genome. This map contains the code of life for humans, that which makes us different from other living species, that which is unique to us. It took about 12 years, and in today's dollars, $4.7 billion to do that. But the information contained here is really important and helpful for scientists and doctors to understand what's going on with us as it relates to our health and when we get sick. Today, any one of us could go to a lab and through a simple blood test using complex technologies, have our entire genetic material analyzed in just a few hours for about a couple $1,000s. So the technology is there and the means are there, but there's some considerations about going down this road. I like to think of personalized medicine as a personalized choice as it relates to these important issues. So though we have the potential to sequence our entire genome as individuals and come up with an owner's operations manual to help us and our doctors make treatment decisions, we have a lot of information from doing this, but there's also some information we're not quite sure what to do with. So we're in the early innings of this process of really translating it all to important stuff that we can use in routine medical practice. One of the other issues to consider whenever you go down this road is that sometimes you might get information you don't like. You might learn that you have a predisposition for a disease that there's no cure or treatment for, and so if you know that, that can be pretty anxiety-provoking. So these are important questions that you and your doctor would have to consider. But I just want to summarize the technologies here. We're making progress in terms of understanding what's available to us through understanding the genome, and it is making its way into routine medical practice. I think one of the stories that really helps tie this all together that's understandable relates to Angelina Jolie, the famous Hollywood actress. Right now, there are a variety of blood tests that screen for cancer and your risk for cancer. And you do this screening whenever you're not feeling sick. So you have no symptoms, but for some reason you and your doctor may determine you have a risk for developing it and you want to know that. In Angelina Jolie's case, she lost a mother and an aunt at early age to breast cancer. And that's consistent with a very specific type of breast cancer that you can detect by doing a simple blood test. So she and her physician discussed this, and she decided to have the test. And based on its positive result, it's called the BRCA gene, it was positive, and that meant that her risk of developing breast cancer was about 90%. So she had this test while she was cancer-free. She was not sick, but she elected to have the double mastectomy to prevent the cancer from occurring. So this is an example of using tools of technology in our genetic makeup and what we know to screen and prevent for things like cancer. Currently, there's no other medication or treatment for this specific type of breast cancer, so the standard has been the double mastectomy. And that's an important differentiation. There's more than one type of breast cancer. And as we understand at a deeper level what's going on, we can make more precise, personalized treatment decisions. Imagine if tumors can talk. This is about using precision diagnostics to really drill down to the level of what's going on with cancer. And if cancer does occur, picking the most precise medication to treat it. This picture shows normal blood cells, normal tissue in pink at the bottom. The purple represents tumor or abnormal cell growth. And what we now know is that cancer is a disease of the genome, of the genes and the proteins. And what we know is tumors now talk to us. We have the tools of technology to screen and understand exactly what they're made up of. And that's what the green boxes show, the base codes, the C, G, A, and T. Sounds a little bit technical, and it is, but what this does, it gives doctors very specific information about the type of cancer you have. This is important for a couple of reasons. Cancer used to be cancer. It was treated and categorized based on where it occurred in the body. Breast cancer was breast cancer, lung cancer, pancreatic cancer. And it was treated using broad-based interventions, things like surgery, radiation, and chemo, which attacked both healthy and normal cells. The point is, if we understand more precisely what the cancer cells are made of, and we understand the defect in the tissue, scientists and doctors can then develop medications to target the specific type of cancer while preserving the healthy cells. So we've come a long way as it relates to understanding the genes and their relationship with cancer. Scientists are now studying how the genes communicate with each other and amongst each other and how they work. This is known as the human proteome. The phrase proteome comes from the phrase proteins expressed by a genome. So you have all of the genes and all the proteins talking amongst themselves. This is important because the relationship among cancer, disease, and genes and the proteins are found here. I like to think of it as discovering the wild, wild west. The land was always there, but the further out you went, the more you understood. And that's kind of what's happening here. This information has been here for a very long time. We just now have the tools to access it, to use it, and to improve the human condition, though it does take some time. This picture sort of summarizes what I've just been talking about. Each cell in the human body contains all the genetic material, the genome. We have chromosomes, we have the DNA, and the genes, they contain the instructions for making these proteins I just referenced. There's trillions of proteins, each with a very specific purpose. The proteins can either act alone or in combination with other proteins to perform the functions that are critical for life. And again, this is important because the deeper we get into understanding the precise proteins, the more we understand the relationship between genes and disease. And if we understand it, we can diagnose it, we can prevent it or screen for it, or we can develop treatments that are more precise and transform the disease instead of just managing the symptoms. So what's happening here is actually shifting doctors and scientists to rethink the war on cancer. The war on cancer was proclaimed in 1971 when President Nixon signed into legislation the National Cancer Act. And he signed this legislation into law to provide more funding to find a cure for cancer, which had been around for decades. And we've come a long way since then in nearly every front except finding a cure and improving mortality. It's the second leading cause of death then and now. And we're spending a lot of money on cancer, about $150 billion each year on cancer care. So we've heard all this before. What's different this time? Well, in two words, the immune system. Our bodies are equipped with a system that surveils and scans for threats, external threats, things like viruses, bacteria, parasites. And when it identifies one, it selects the appropriate response and rids our body from this harm. Part of the problem with finding a cure for cancer is related to cancer cells being very clever. They can avoid detection by the immune system, shut it down, wreak havoc on it, and the cells grow and overrun the body. This is a pretty scary picture if you think about it, but it represents what's going on in your body whenever cancer cells start to run awry and your immune system can't protect you from it. The thinking now is that if scientists target the immune system, re-regulate it, and outsmart cancer, that the body's own immune system can fight off the cancer. Well, how does cancer occur? Simply stated, you get cancer one of three ways. Maybe you inherit a mutation or a risk from your parents. Something goes wrong in the cell replication process. What this means is Human beings have trillions of cells. Each cell has a function. Cells have different amount of lifespans. Whenever the function is served, the cells die. But for life to continue, a new cell needs to be produced. And so the mother cell passes on all the genetic material to the daughter cells. I think of this complicated process like photocopying an entire encyclopedia 1 trillion times a day. The sheer volume, even with the best equipment, is going to mean some errors get through. And so whenever these sorts of errors occur, tumor cells can accumulate and you can get cancer. Other times, we just don't know why. But it is something that runs awry in the gene process. Every day, at least once a day, your immune system, if functioning properly, destroys a cell that would have become cancer if it lived. Immune oncology. This is where the real shift in thinking in terms of the war on cancer is occurring right now. Incidentally, Science magazine in December of 2013 named immune oncology as the breakthrough scientific therapy of the year. Immune oncology is what scientists and doctors are doing right now. They're working to develop this new class of medication that outsmarts cancer, that re-regulates the immune system, turns it back on to rid the body of cancer. Now this slide's a little bit tricky and complicated. And I included it on purpose because the relationship between cancer and the immune system is pretty complicated. And we're in the early innings here. But in summary, on the left, you'll see the APC. That stands for antigen-presenting cell. The body can detect what doesn't belong with it. APC is a protein given off by a cancer cell, very specific to that cancer cell. If functioning properly, the immune system, or the T cell, identifies it, rids the body of this harm. Depending on the type of cancer cell, though, it can interact with just a few of the checkpoints and proteins that turn the immune system on and off and regulate it. That's what's represented by these letters, numbers, and arrows. So what cancer cells do is they can attach to any one of these places and prevent the immune system from ridding your body of cancer. This is a relatively new class of medication, like I say. In 2011, Bristol-Myers Squibb had the first medication in this class approved for the treatment of a previously deadly type of skin cancer called melanoma. Prior to this medication, there was really very few options. But what they're seeing is a response in quite a few patients, and in some, cures. Now the interesting thing is, it doesn't work the same on all patients. Though it's showing quite a bit of promise, there's still some complexity and mystery to it. But the other thing they're finding is it works in more than just one type of cancer. They're testing it in lung cancer, bladder and kidney cancer, and they're seeing similar results. Significant tumor shrinkage, and it's giving them the greatest hope for finding a cure because our immune systems have memory. And what they're really trying to do is find a way to activate the immune system to recognize the cancer cells as enemies to rid off. Part of the problem with cancer cells is they develop resistance even to the best targeted precision medications. That's how smart they are. But the thinking here is much like a booster shot you get whenever you're immunized. Sometimes you get a series of shots, you build up immunity, and then you're forever protected. They're trying to do the same thing as it relates to cancer here. And you're thinking the best hope for a cure relates to targeting multiple components of the immune system to really make the boost more powerful. And they're also considering giving this with the targeted precision medications I talked about earlier that go to the precise underlying abnormal cells and destroying them. The insights that we're getting from understanding the immune system apply not only to cancer, but to other diseases as well. Some of them are chronic in nature. And I'd like to shift the discussion now to talking about how we're able to cure some conditions that were previously chronic and lifelong in nature. In particular, a couple of these are caused by viruses. So what is a virus? We're hearing quite a bit about viruses these days with the threat of Ebola. Viruses are very tiny organisms. They cannot exist on their own. They require a host. Once they find one, they hijack it. They insert their own DNA and begin to replicate that whole photocopying process I mentioned earlier, and they just sort of take over the host. Interesting, though, they can remain dormant for decades, and you really aren't aware of what's going on, or you can get a virus and know you have it right away, and it can be pretty deadly with something like Ebola. So viruses run the gamut. Some are benign, like strains of the flu, which can be a difficult couple of days, but once it passes, you're okay. Or it can be more chronic and severe in nature, like hepatitis C, HIV, or deadly, like the Ebola. Another example of a virus would be chickenpox. You get that as a kid, it resolves, but the virus is still dormant in your body. And maybe you're under stress a couple decades later and it pops up as shingles. So that gives you a picture of what viruses are like. I'd like to talk a little bit about hepatitis C because we're hearing some things about this. Hepatitis C is caused by a virus, and what it does is it attacks the liver. And it can be a silent type of virus. It may be in your body and you have no idea, and in fact, a lot of people have it and don't know, so you should get tested. The CDC has recommended that baby boomers get tested. And part of that is because it does damage to your liver. You don't know you have it, it's doing damage, even though you don't necessarily feel sick until it's kind of too late. But if you were diagnosed with hepatitis C, it's a chronic condition. You have to take a lot of medications. Sometimes the medications work, sometimes they don't. Sometimes you can develop cancer, liver cancer, or need a liver transplant, all pretty costly stuff. Well, in December of 2013, Gilead Sciences had Sovaldi approved, and it provides a cure for hepatitis C. You take it 8 to 12 weeks, and for certain strains of hepatitis, completely cured. In October of this year, they improved on their medication and have another one that's been approved by the FDA that doesn't require the use of interferon. Interferon you have to take sometimes with these medicines and they cause you to get really sick and flu-like. Well, their new medication approved just last month doesn't require the use of interferon. So that's an example of how you innovate and provide the next generation or better medication to treat the same things. And the tools of science and technology are allowing companies to do that. When I think of viruses, sometimes it's kind of a scary thing. They require a host, they invade, they hijack, they insert their own DNA. But the tools of technology and science are actually allowing doctors to use viruses for good. There's an example of a virus that can be programmed through engineering to target cancer cells and destroy cancer. It's known as oncolytic viruses. So there's a lot of really cool stuff going on as it relates to science, technology, engineering, and how it applies to medicine, and how these things are improving the human condition. And as an analyst covering the healthcare industry, I find this really exciting too, in terms of investment opportunities. And that brings me to the next topic, the related investment opportunities, and how, if you're one of our clients, you've been participating. I'm going to talk first about how I approach the universe, looking for stocks, and then about some of the companies that we own stock in, and have owned stock in, that are participating in the innovations I've talked about just now. Investors, regardless of where they're looking, face choices about risk and reward. How much risk do you want to take? And how much reward will you get for taking it? Biomedical science companies are no different. You have small R&D companies. These companies tend not to have much revenue, if any, no earnings. They may have a really good scientific idea and a hypothesis that they're researching, and it may just be in the early phases of testing in humans to see if it works. If they get it right, it's probably going to be a pretty big payoff. A lot of risk, may not get it right, and you can lose everything you're investing in. You have mid-sized companies with niche products, so maybe they have something that's a little bit further progressed down the line of making it to routine medical practice. Maybe they're testing it in patients and it's showing positive signs. They may have some collaboration revenue, people doing partnerships with them, a little bit of earnings. And then there's the mature, fully integrated global companies. At Mullenkamp and Company, we approach investing in biomedical companies the way we approach other companies. We tend to focus on the mature, fully integrated companies. As Ron likes to say, we'll walk out on the limb a little bit, but not the full way. Ron likes to say he wants to buy Cadillac at Chevy prices. I want to buy a Porsche at a Volkswagen price when I look at biomedical companies. We have an internal, intrinsic, proprietary model that we use to value companies and determine what they're worth. I say that because we use PE and ROE as screens and inputs that go into that model. We like to look for a company or a stock that has a price-to-earnings ratio, or PE, that is below the return on equity. And that helps us figure out what we think the company's really worth. We like solid balance sheets, free cash flow. We like companies with revenue and earnings growth. An example of one of the companies that we own that's participating in the innovation I talked about today is Gilead Sciences. It's a mature, fully integrated global company. They have leadership in infectious disease, especially viruses. They were one of the first to market with a cure for hepatitis C, and they're considered to have the leading treatment for hepatitis C. We've owned them long before this treatment was approved because we were following the science as it went through the channel. For more than a decade, they have been the leader in HIV. HIV was previously a death sentence. The innovation and the new medications they have brought to market make it a chronic disease that can be managed. And they're continuing to improve the medications that they bring to market to treat to treat HIV. You used to have to take handfuls of these medications several times a day. Now one pill contains 4 different medicines. You take it once or twice a day, and your condition is managed. But they're not stopping there. They're working tirelessly to find a cure for HIV, much like they did for hepatitis. But they're also expanding their scope. They understand the relationship between the immune system and cancer. That's immune oncology. That's the new class of medications we've been talking about. And they have some pretty promising medications that are being studied right now in clinical trials that are showing some promise. Looking at the stock and the valuation metrics, it's pretty attractive. It's trading at a forward PE, or forward price to earnings ratio, at about 11. It's less than the return on equity, which is 20%. This says it's greater than 20. We adjust companies' return on equity numbers if they are pretty high, because we want to be conservative as we put them into our model. And we think 20% is more sustainable than the mid-70s that Gilead's ROE is currently at. And if you look at their earnings and revenue growth over the next 3 years on an annualized basis, it's pretty attractive, with 15% earnings per share growth and 10% revenue growth. Next is Celgene Corporation, another mature, fully integrated global company. They have leadership in oncology, which is cancer, and the immune system. So they were early to understand the relationship between cancer and the immune system. And they have multiple products that are approved, generating revenue now for that. But they're also skating to where the puck is going to be. They understand this next generation of immune oncology and the next generation cancer medicines that are being developed in the war on cancer toward finding a cure. And Celgene exemplifies the importance of having multiple partnerships. And what I mean by that is, it's a big company. They have their own internal staff of people that are constantly researching. They want to make sure that though they have market-leading positions right now in certain products, they don't get undercut by any surprise, because there's a lot of rapidly evolving innovation with the technology. And so they scan the environment for these new frontier companies, and if they find something they like, they'll partner with them. So as a shareholder in this company, you get to participate in some of that new frontier medicine and R&D without taking on all the risk. Looking at the valuation metrics on the stock of Celgene, looks about fair. It's trading at a price to earnings ratio going forward at 22, above our adjusted return on equity measure of 20. 3-year earnings per share annualized is 29%. Revenue is about 20% annualized. So the growth is pretty attractive. And so it becomes more attractive, although it is bordering on fair valuation. But we've said we're willing to pay up for a company or hold a company if we have conviction in the underlying science and the growth prospects. And that's kind of what Celgene is for us. They're participating in some of the really cutting-edge stuff and have some growth in their pipeline. We've owned Celgene and Gilead both for a little over 2 years and have more than doubled our money in those stocks. So we didn't quite buy Celgene at 22 times earnings, but we're comfortable holding now based on what they have coming down the pipeline. Bristol Myers Squibb is the last company I'm going to talk about today. Note the theme. It's a mature, fully integrated company, global in nature. Means they have sales outside the US as well. And it's a company in transition. It's transitioning from pharma to biomedical. What does that mean? It means that it's changing the type of products that it sells. So it's divested its diabetes business. In the past, they focused on things like blood clots, cholesterol, and they're skating to where the puck is. They're the leaders in immune oncology. The next generation medications, they're showing promise toward providing a cure for cancer. In fact, they had the first FDA immune oncology medication for melanoma, which I discussed a little bit earlier, that's showing response where none was seen before, meaning patients improve, and in some cases, complete cures. And they're finding that this immune oncology is applicable to other types of cancers, and they have late-phase clinical trials in lung, bladder, and kidney as we speak. Looking at the stock valuation metrics on Bristol Myers Squibb, looks a little bit pricey, 33 times next year's earnings. It's above the return on equity of 18%. But it's a company in transition, so some of that can be explained by some of the businesses they're selling off and all the investing they're doing in their pipeline for immune oncology. With that said, it has decent earnings growth of 15% and revenue growth of 6%, also related to the moving parts of selling off some businesses and investing heavily. But we think what's happening in their pipeline in terms of what's going on in immune oncology makes this a very interesting company, and we're keeping a close eye on it. So, we've talked about quite a bit today. We've talked about the healthcare industry as it relates to you, the consumer. We've talked about how much we're spending on healthcare and what we're spending it on. We've talked about how we're benefiting in terms of products that improve the human condition and are extending our life expectancy. And as an investment analyst, there's a lot of interesting opportunities here to look for. We've also talked about some of the game-changing advances in biomedical science. We talked about how we're shifting the model toward personalized medicine, towards disease prevention instead of disease management. We've talked about how we're rethinking the war on cancer, and specifically as it relates to immune oncology and harnessing the body's own army to fight cancer, ideally to find a cure. And we've talked about how we're able to use all this innovation and technology to cure conditions that were previously lifelong. For example, hepatitis C. Also talked about how we approach investing in the companies and stocks, and how, if you're one of our investors, you have been participating through the 3 companies that I talked about today. And like I say, we've owned them for a little over 2 years and have done pretty well. We've more than doubled our money. So, covered a lot in about 40 minutes here. And I'm not sure I've addressed all your questions, but if you have any, feel free to catch me after. And if you're interested, there's a companion booklet I wrote that goes into a little bit more detail. You can pick one of these up on the way out. Thank you. At this time, I'd like to turn the presentation over to Jeff Mullenkamp, and he will provide an update on Europe and Japan.
Thanks, Tammy. We're going to move from the opportunity discussion to a threat discussion. So we've talked to you over the last couple of years, really since 2008, when the Great Recession hit the U.S. and then rolled around through the world. And we told you that there are some areas around the world that we were concerned about. And we've told you since then that they really haven't gotten any better. And we told you we keep an eye on them. So we're going to update you on what we're seeing for about 15 minutes today. This chart is a comparison of the size of the balance sheets of the central banks relative to the size of the underlying economy. So it's the balance sheet divided by GDP as a percentage. So it kind of gives you an idea of what the different central banks are doing relative to their economy and relative to each other. The black line on top is the Bank of Japan. The red line in the middle is the U.S. Federal Reserve. The Bank of England is the gray line. It kind of ends up right where the Fed ends up, and then the ECB is the light blue line. So you can see in 2006 that the Bank of England and the Fed, their balance sheets relative to the economy were pretty small compared to certainly what the Bank of Japan was doing and also what the European Central Bank was doing. When the crisis hit in 2008, everybody expanded their balance sheet, almost in lockstep. In 2012, the ECB quit expanding its balance sheet. And in 2013, the Bank of Japan hit the afterburners and went for, frickin' orbit, actually. And we'll talk about the Bank of Japan in a little bit more detail in 10 minutes or so. And then the Bank of England, and the Bank of England kind of leveled off in early 2013. Our Fed has stopped buying additional assets here recently, so it should level off here. That's what they've told us they're going to do. They have said that they're not going to shrink it. They're going to leave it where it is and reinvest as assets mature. So this is a little bit closer look. You've seen this before if you've been with us for a couple of years. This is our Fed balance sheet as size in trillions of dollars, and you can see it's basically a stair step. So QE1, we took a step up. QE2, we took a step up. QE3, we took a step up. It's now about 25% of GDP. That's what the last chart told you. It's about $4.5 trillion. And what the Fed has said is we're going to reinvest the proceeds when our assets mature. We'll reinvest it and keep the balance sheet at this size. This is a similar chart. It looks a little busier because the European Central Bank categorizes its assets a little bit differently. But this is what the European Central Bank has done really since about 2007. So similar to the Fed, it's stair-stepped up. That peaked in 2012. Unlike the Fed, they have allowed their balance sheet to contract. So instead of reinvesting, relending the money that is paid off, and for them it was primarily the long-term refinancing operation where they lent money to the banks. They weren't buying bonds specifically. They were lending money cheaply to their banks. As that money is repaid, they're not relending it. So they're shrinking their balance sheet. So you say, why does that matter? What does this do? Well, when a central bank expands its balance sheet, the idea is that they will create money, lend it to somebody, usually the government, not always, and that money then finds its way out into the economy and keeps rates low in an effort to spur economic activity, to get things moving. So whereas the United States and Japan has continued to push money or to try to push money into the economy with greater or lesser effect, because there are other steps in the chain there, but that's what they've been trying to do, creating money, trying to push it into the economy. The European Central Bank has not. They quit doing that in 2012, which was kind of the last headline peak, if you will, for their crisis. And in fact, what they've been doing is they've been contracting the amount of credit available to their economies. So even though they said, we'll do whatever it takes to keep the European Union together, to keep the euro as a viable currency, they have not been doing the same thing that Japan, the United States, and England have been doing. They've actually been shrinking their balance sheet. They're not the only ones to do that. In Europe, a lot of lending is done not through bond markets, but through the banks. So the US does a lot more with bond markets and securities markets, where companies, even large companies, do most of that activity through the banks in Europe. So it's very important to understand what the banks, not just the central banks, are doing with their lending. This chart is an aggregate chart of all the banks except the different national central banks and the aggregate size of their balance sheets. And you can see that since 2012, they've been shrinking it. They've been reducing the amount of credit they are making available to their economies and to those businesses. What the European Central Bank did, about 9 months ago, they announced a targeted long-term refinance operation which was the follow-on to the LTRO. Now they have the TLTRO. And they said, well, we will lend money to the banks cheaply if they promise to go around and relend it to business. And there's been very little uptake on that program. The banks are not interested in doing that. Part of the reason they're not interested in doing that is because from a regulatory perspective, they are being, if you remember about 3 weeks ago, they had a health check, a stress test. And the results of those were published. And there were 25 banks, some of them pretty big in Europe, that didn't pass the stress test. And of those that didn't pass, 12 of them had to go out and raise more capital. The other 13 had already been doing so. So the banks have been encouraged by regulators to hold more capital. If you're encouraged by regulators to hold more capital, it means you're not lending it out. So they're either maintaining their balance sheets at the same size or they're shrinking it to meet regulatory requirements, even as the ECB really wishes they'd go make more loans and try to get things going in the economy. So you've got some tension between what the regulators want to do in terms of having solvent and stable banks and what the ECB wants to have done in terms of encouraging economic activity. But the long and short of it is the banks have been shrinking their balance sheet. And the central bank has been shrinking its balance sheet, which means the availability of credit throughout Europe is less. That's what they've been doing. So, what has that resulted in terms of gross domestic product in Europe? So this is a chart of the real, that is inflation-adjusted gross domestic product for a variety of companies in Europe since 2007. And we'll kind of walk them through from the top to the bottom. The top is the UK in orange, 3% growth. Remember, they expanded their balance sheet quite dramatically earlier than the US did, and they've got about 3% GDP growth. Coming down from them in blue is Germany, and right below that is black is France. Those are the two largest economies in the Eurozone. Germany had been growing quite nicely. That's now fading. Quite nicely being about 2%, it's now down to about 1%. France had been growing at 1%, it's now down to 0%. So the two biggest economies in Europe are either not growing, France, or growing much more slowly, Germany. Right there between those two is Spain. Spain did a double-dip recession and is now growing pretty nicely, but they got hit pretty hard. They're growing from a very low base. Below that, green is Italy and brown is Greece. Both of those countries continue to contract on a real basis, not by a lot. And certainly Greece has gotten a lot better, Italy has gotten a lot better, but they're not expanding. They're contracting a little bit. Another way to look at that is on a per capita basis. And that's this chart. So this is per capita GDP since 2008, inflation adjusted. Looks pretty good if you're Germany. So per capita, they continue to expand their economy. France has been flat since early 2011 at a level that is lower than it was in the first quarter of 2008. So not so good. Spain had been contracting until about 2 quarters ago and is finally starting to turn the corner on a per capita basis, Italy continues to trail off. So a little bit different picture, but not a whole lot more encouraging, really, in the aggregate. Looking at unemployment, this is European unemployment, or this is unemployment in a variety of different European countries since 2006. Starting from the top, you can see Greece and Spain at about 25% unemployment. That's starting to come down for both of them, but still very, very high, very concerningly high. Blue is Italy at a little over 10%, high and staying there. France in red at about 10%, high and maybe getting a little worse, certainly not getting any better. And the UK is in pretty good shape and improving a bit, and Germany is in quite good shape and staying that way. So again, quite a mix from an unemployment perspective of what's going on in Europe. We keep an eyeball on bond rates for all the sovereigns. A lot of times, certainly what we saw in 2009 and then again in 2011 and 2012, is as these companies with high government debt levels started to enter a recession, there became concerns that they would be unable to service their debt and they might default. And you saw that 2 places. The first place you saw that was in CDS spreads. We'll show you that in the next chart. And you also saw it in their bond rates. So this is kind of a stress meter. This is kind of the market's opinion of how bad things are in that country. Again, since 2006. So what you can see is that the stress you saw, particularly in Greece, which is in blue, but also in Italy and Spain, which is green and purple there, but the stress that you saw there in 2012 has largely dissipated. In fact, every country on that chart, with the exception of Greece, can borrow for 10 years cheaper than the United States. That's kind of a fascinating comparison. So that makes sense if they're entering deflation. So those rates, borrowing at 2% for 10 years, makes sense if you're anticipating something like 1 or 2% deflation. Then the market is probably accurately pricing that in, and on a real basis, you'll make what we think of as a normal return on a 10-year. If that's not what happens, then you've got somebody who, then it may well be that those prices are manipulated, that those prices are not set by the market, that they are not reflecting the underlying things going on in the economy, that in fact perhaps banks are encouraged to buy that debt even though it doesn't make sense for them to do so. So would I be excited about owning European debt? Matter of fact, I would not. I don't think you're going to be rewarded for the risk that you're in fact taking. But, so that kind of a two-parter out of this chart. One, we don't see the market being stressed out about the debt levels of those countries right now. Two, we don't like the prices of those bonds. And then I had mentioned credit default swaps. This is a credit default swap is analogous to the price of insurance on a bond. So when the price goes up, you're paying more to insure that bond and make sure that you're covered in case it defaults. When prices come down, people are less concerned that it's going to default. You can see that Greece went off the chart. Greece is the brown line on top. Greece went off the chart there in 2011 and 2012. That's come back to what, for Greece, is certainly much lower levels. It's higher than most anybody else out there. But the levels across the board are much lower than they were in 2011 and 2012. And while they've ticked up a little bit in the last 3 months or so, they're not at a point where we would consider that this is a sign of stress or concern. So, very quickly walked you through some of the things we routinely keep an eye on. What do you take away from that? Nobody's too worried about European bonds defaulting in the near term. Bond yields in Europe are low, and that either means deflation's coming or the prices aren't reflective of economic reality, but they look too high for us, and frankly, it's not attractive. Economically, there's a mix, there's a spread among the Eurozone. In the aggregate, the IMF thinks that there's a 40% chance that Europe as a whole goes into recession next year, and there's a 30% chance that they have deflation. So at best, you have low growth. At worst, you're entering a recession as things kind of tail off. And then you've got a European Central Bank that, irrespective of what they've said, is not pushing liquidity, is not pushing money into the Eurozone to try and spark economic development. So really the takeaway is we're not concerned about it in the near term, but it's not a good picture, and it's frankly not getting better. So we'll continue to keep an eyeball on it. That's Europe. Japan. I'm not sure we've talked to you guys about Japan too much. Japan is really interesting, really fun. And Halloween Day, 31st of October, the Japanese came out and surprised everybody. So on the 31st of October, the Bank of Japan said that they were going to spend not 50 trillion yen buying government bonds and other assets next year, but 80 trillion yen next year. And you say, well, what does that mean in real money? So that's about $410 billion was what they had been buying, and now they're going to do $667 billion equivalent per year. So if you think about that relative, when we were doing QE at the rate of $85 billion a month, that's a little over $1 trillion per year of asset purchases. So on an absolute basis, they are doing less than that. They're only doing 2/3 of that at $666 billion. On a relative basis, for instance, relative to the size of the gross domestic product of the country, it doesn't look so pretty. So our GDP is about 14 trillion. Their GDP is 4.9 trillion. So while as we were doing about 6% of our GDP, they in fact are doing 13% of their GDP. It turns out that their government deficit, the amount that they have to borrow to fund government expenses every year, is about 7% of GDP. So put those two numbers together. The government has to borrow 7% of GDP next year. The Bank of Japan is going to create enough money and then go buy 13% worth of GDP of assets. Twice as much. So the Bank of Japan is going to create money and lend half of it to the government of Japan so they can go cover their deficit and do their expenses. And with the other half, they're going to go buy financial assets existing in the market. Some of that is going to be Japanese debt, some of that is going to be REITs, some of that is going to be ETFs in their markets. That's how much money they're creating. They're creating twice as much as they need to just to fund their government. And with it, they are accumulating assets denominated in Japanese yen. The same day, the largest pension fund in the world, the Japanese government pension fund, something like that, which has $1.3 trillion converted over to dollars in assets, said that we are going to shift our allocation from 50% Japanese debt down, 60% Japanese debt down to 35% Japanese debt. All right, I'm going to get this wrong. Yes, 60% Japanese debt to 35% Japanese debt, right? So they're cutting their bound allocation. And they're applying that to both foreign and domestic equities. So for them, that's Japanese equities and foreign equities. That's a change of $325 billion. That's how much is going to shift from Japanese bonds to equities of some sort, which is why stock markets cheered. Yay! We just got told that somebody's going to enter the market and spend $325 billion on things that I hold. And so I can front run them, and it'll be fun, and we'll make money. And so they did some of that. And what else do you see? That same day, they said, we're going to sell $325 billion worth of Japanese debt. And conveniently, the Bank of Japan, the same day, said, well, we're going to buy some more of that. Doesn't that fit neatly together? So you've got the pension fund backing away from Japanese debt, and the Bank of Japan, in what would seem to be a coordinated move, but perhaps was not, stepping right into that gap to make sure that the Japanese government can continue to borrow money seamlessly. So that was kind of the big news. Back to this chart. So we talked before about the central banks kind of across the world, and we talked a little bit about Japan, and you can see how Japan, with the initiation of Abenomics in 2013, as Prime Minister Abe outlined his plans to spur growth and inflation in Japan. As a part of that, the Bank of Japan started buying a lot of assets. And when you look at that chart, you're like, holy cow. And to me, that's a very stark chart. They're going in a direction, and they're going faster than anybody else ever has in terms of creating money and lending it to the government or buying other assets out there. And what they just told us was they're going to do another 13% of GDP. So that little orange ball, that's my little joke, right? Land of the rising sun. Okay, rising sun, that's an orange ball. It's about as funny as I get. That's where it's going to be next year. 53% plus 13%, give or take more or less. It's about 65% of their GDP is going to be the size of their balance sheet next year. It's off the chart. So very dramatic movements, very dramatic actions by the Japanese central bank that were just announced. And you're kind of thinking, well, why are they doing this? Let's start a little bit with why is that pension fund backing away from government bonds? Why are they doing that? They've been there a long time. Why now? This is a chart of real and nominal interest rates and inflation in Japan going back to 2000. So the blue line is the nominal, Let me flip to my chart here so I can get the colors right for you. The blue line is the 10-year government bond rate. So that's the nominal rate. CPI is in red. You'll notice that for most of the last 14 years, Japan has been experiencing deflation. In the last year, compliments of Abenomics and all the printing in the back of Japan, that's flipped. And they're now experiencing mild inflation. It's not the targeted 2%, but it's positive, which means that the green line, which is inflation adjusted, has now gone negative. So if you were a holder of a Japanese 10-year, for 14 years, even though you were nominally only making 1% or 1.5%, on an inflation-adjusted basis, you were making something like 2.5 or 3. And that worked, right? The purchasing power of your yen is going up, so you're not making much on a nominal basis, but when it comes time to pay the bills, which for a pension fund is to pay the retirees, you were in good shape, you were able to do that. Now that the real yield is negative, you cannot. You are losing purchasing power by holding on to that asset. And if you continue to do that, you will not be able to meet the obligations that you are required to by law. So as a fiduciary, thinking of the interest of your client, the retiree, you have got to do something. You have got to get out of there. You are losing money. Instead of risk-adjusted return, you have, well, I screwed that up. Never mind. You're losing money. You're guaranteed to lose money. So that's why, in my opinion, the pension fund is backing out of Japanese bonds. Because that particular pension, which is the largest in the world, is closely tied with the government, that's why the Bank of Japan seamlessly stepped in and said, to make sure there's no hiccup in the Japanese bond market, we're going to backfill you. You had been a big buyer, now we'll be the big buyer, and there won't be a hiccup. But that's why they did it. This is a look at Japanese government debt since 1972. Both on an absolute basis and on a percent of revenue basis. So the blue diamonds are the interest payments in trillions of yen, and that's against the left axis. So you can see that as Japan borrowed more and more money through the 70s and early 80s, their interest payments in yen went up. And then they plateaued through the 80s, came down a little bit into the 90s and early 2000s, and now they've spiked back up. The red boxes are the interest payments as a percentage of tax revenue. So this is how much they're paying as a percentage of what they're taking in. So a very similar pattern. Ran up in the 70s, early 80s, kind of plateaued, dropped into the early 2000s, and now it's running back up to where it was again. They're paying 25% of their tax revenue to pay the interest on their debt. That's why their government is in a bind. This is another way to look at what's going on. So what you've got on the chart here are the yield curves for Japanese debt in 2009, that's the green, and in 2014. And then the vertical lines are the weighted average duration of their outstanding debt in those 2 years. So in 2009, that's the blue line, and in 2013, that's the red line. So what does this chart tell you? The first thing it tells you is, in 5 years, the cost of their debt came down across the spectrum. So both of those curves shifted down. But instead of extending their debt maturities and locking in those low rates for a long period of time, they did exactly the opposite. They borrowed money, on average, for shorter durations. Why'd they do that? If they had gone longer, and you'll see this starkly here in a minute, they couldn't afford it. So even though long 30-year rates were lower than they had been, they still couldn't afford them. So they shifted their borrowing shorter, which means they have to roll it over faster. So instead of rolling it over every 8 years in 2009, they're down to about every 6 years in 2013. So They continue to borrow more, and they have to roll over that debt faster and faster. So they're on a treadmill that keeps speeding up. As a kind of thought exercise, some folks at Seeking Alpha said, well, gee, what would the average interest have to be for their interest payments to consume all their revenue? And so they came up with, assuming that revenue stayed flat. The answer is a little bit less than 2%. If the interest on the Japanese debt was 2%, it would consume all of their taxes. 2% is about the yield on their 30-year, or it was in 2009. That's why they didn't do that. They couldn't. It would consume all their tax revenue. So the bind that Japan finds itself in the 80s, when they had their stock market collapse and their property bubble collapse, in order to goose the economy, they started spending a lot of money on behalf of the government. They were trying to do what Lord Keynes said should be done and excite demand through government spending. And they have been doing that for 20 years. As a result, they have a huge government debt, about 250% of their GDP, which means they have a huge interest payment, 25% of their revenues. If that rate of interest goes up, they will be unable to afford it. The only way to guarantee that those interest rates stay low is to have a guaranteed lender. That's the Bank of Japan. So the Bank of Japan is now not only buying all their new debt at rock bottom rates, but soaking up all the existing debt. Even as the pension fund, and I use that kind of as a proxy, because my guess is most other folks who own Japanese assets will look to that and say, what do they know that I don't? Start backing away because they're losing money. And so they've made promises they have a responsibility to keep, and they can't do it if they have real yields that are negative. Not going to be able to do it. So where does that go? Where does that go in the future? I think you're going to see it in the currency exchange rate. So if this goes according to plan, rates will stay low, the currency will depreciate, the Bank of Japan will end up with probably 50% or better of the outstanding debt of the Japanese government on its balance sheet, and at some point it writes some portion of that off, which is kind of fascinating, because if you remember when Greece wrote off some of its debt, the ECB absolutely positively refused to let them write off of any of their debt, right? So the central banks own some Greek debt, and they say, no, you're paying us in full, screw the other guy. Screw the private investor. Screw the private pension fund. What Japan is doing is saying, we're going to take all that on our balance sheet. It's like they're falling on the grenade. Right? So when the devaluation comes, most of those assets are going to be sitting on the Bank of Japan's balance sheet. They're not going to be sitting on the pension fund's balance sheet. How that works out at that point, I'm not quite sure. In the meantime, what you ought to see is a declining yen. Well, what does that mean? One, it means if you're buying Japanese labor, it should get cheaper. Right? So Japan doesn't have too many of its own natural resources, so if the value of the yen declines, they're going to pay more, and if you're buying a car from Japan, well, that steel that they pay more for, they're going to pass along to you, etc. But Japanese labor is probably going to get cheap. Japanese engineering is probably going to get cheap. So Japan is going to be exporting essentially deflation, even as they're holding on to inflation. So internally, it's going to look like inflation. As the cost of energy goes up, the cost of raw materials go up, the cost of everything they import goes up. Externally, it's going to be looking like they export deflation, lower prices, because you're getting cheaper Japanese labor. At some point, folks like Europe, China, and Korea, that compete against Japan, may decide that they have to do something about that, and perhaps they will start devaluing their currency as well. So it is possible you get into a currency war coming out of Japan. If things go according to the Japanese plan and the Japanese central bank is able to absorb and buy all these yen-denominated assets as fast as they're being offered for sale, you'll probably be in decent shape. If people see what's going on and say, I want out faster than that, I see that the Japanese yen is going to depreciate in value and I want out now, and if they run from the currency faster than the Japanese central bank can buy those assets up, you may have a collapse in the currency. That's kind of the extreme worst case end of it. You have a currency collapse and it becomes worthless. You get hyperinflation internally, and on an international basis, the yen goes to essentially zero. We'll get to you, Mr. A. We're not ready for a question, I'm sorry. So either way, you've got some pretty serious concerns out of what's been going on in Japan. And the setup has been there for years, and a lot of people have been watching this. To me, what the Bank of Japan announced on October 31st was a flashing neon sign that we are down that road. That we are down the road of currency devaluation and potentially down the road of something a little bit nastier than that. Not certain, but you are definitely on that path. There is no reason to be doubtful about where Japan is going. They said, here we are, and this is where we're going, and off you go. So Japan is more concerning now than it had been. They are taking much larger actions to try and fight their problem, and that whole situation kind of continues to devolve, if you will.